marina air hung thick and heavy, smelling of salt, diesel, and the kind of wealth that felt like a physical presence. Chloe stared, her mouth slightly agape, at the vessel docked at the end of the pier. It wasn't a boat, it was a floating monument, sleek, impossibly white, with lines so clean they seemed to have been drawn by a beam of light. The yacht was a declaration of power. It was over 200 feet of silent, intimidating elegance. Beside her lawyer, a man named Arthur Vance, adjusted his tie with a smug little tug. He saw the yacht not as a thing of beauty, but as an asset, a colossal figure on a balance sheet he was about to divide. He thought this would be easy. He believed his case was unassailable, a simple matter of undisclosed assets and marital fraud. He didn't know that he was about to argue law with a man who built his life on unshakable foundations. Within 1 hour, Arthur Vance's career would be in jeopardy, and the life his client, Chloe, had so carefully constructed would be utterly demolished. What they didn't know was that the man they were about to confront, the quiet, unassuming man they had both dismissed as a failure, had not hidden his wealth. He had earned it long after they had written him off. Have you ever seen someone so utterly convinced they were right? When you knew with absolute certainty they were striding confidently toward a cliff's edge. It's a strange, compelling sight. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from today as we witness this very moment unfold. The confidence of the arrogant is a fragile thing, and today it was about to shatter against a truth as solid and unyielding as the sea itself. It's bigger than the pictures, Chloe finally managed to say, her voice a mixture of awe and avarice. The online article had called it a floating masterpiece, but the words were insufficient. The yacht, named the Cornerstone in elegant silver script on its stern, seemed to absorb the afternoon light and radiate a quiet authority. Bigger means more valuable, Vance said, his eyes gleaming. He clutched a polished leather briefcase that contained what he considered to be an executioner's warrant. He can't hide this, Chloe. It's too big, too public. The fool has cornered himself. Standing slightly behind them, Marcus, Chloe's new partner, scoffed. He was a man tailored to look expensive, from his aggressively stylish haircut to his gleaming Italian loafers. It's ostentatious, he declared, though his eyes betrayed a deep, burning envy. Tacky, really. A desperate cry for attention from a man who never had any. Marcus saw the world as a competition, and in his mind, Ethan had just tried to leapfrog him in the race for status. He couldn't allow that. He was here to witness the takedown, to see Ethan brought low and confirm his own superior position in Chloe's life and in the world. The three of them made a striking tableau of predatory confidence. The scorned ex-wife hungry for what she now believed was rightfully hers. The sharp, merciless lawyer smelling a lucrative contingency fee. The insecure new lover eager to see his predecessor humiliated. They began their walk down the long pier, their footsteps echoing on the weathered wood, each step taking them closer to a confrontation they believed they had already won. They were a phalanx of righteous indignation, armed with legal papers and a profound, unshakable ignorance. And waiting for them in the cool, shaded aft deck of his magnificent vessel was Ethan Hayes, a man who had learned the profound power of patience. He had been expecting them. In fact, he had counted on it. The memory of the lawyer's office was still vivid in Ethan's mind, a sterile, beige room that smelled of old paper and stale coffee. It was a place designed to make people feel small, to strip away emotion and reduce life to clauses and signatures. That day, a year ago, it had worked its intended effect on Chloe, but not in the way the lawyers had hoped. She hadn't felt small, she had felt magnified, triumphant. She sat across the mahogany table, radiating a brittle, victorious energy. Her lawyer, the same Arthur Vance who was now marching toward his yacht, had a thin, condescending smile plastered on his face. "So we are all in agreement," Vance had stated, less a question and more a declaration. He gestured to the sheaf of papers in the center of the table. "Chloe retains the primary residence and the contents therein. The joint savings and investment accounts will be liquidated and split, 60-40 in her favor, in consideration of her waiving any future spousal support claims. Mr. Hayes," he said, turning his gaze on Ethan, "will retain his personal effects and full ownership of his business." The slight pause, the subtle inflection on the word business, was a masterpiece of professional disdain. It painted Ethan's architectural firm, Sterling Ventura, as a worthless hobby, a pittance he was being allowed to keep out of sheer pity. Ethan had said nothing. He simply looked at Chloe, the woman he had shared a decade of his life with. He saw no sadness in her eyes, no flicker of shared history. He saw only impatience, a desperate eagerness to be done with this chapter and move on to her newer, shinier life with Marcus. She had told him as much a month before, in the living room of the house that would soon be solely hers. "It's not that I don't care about you, Ethan," she had said, a line rehearsed to sound gentle but landing with the force of a slap. It's just I need more ambition, more drive. Marcus is closing deals. He's building an empire. You just have your doodles. His doodles were in the worn leather portfolio he held in his lap, the same one he always carried. Inside were not just blueprints and structural calculations, but dreams rendered in graphite and ink. They were the genesis of buildings that integrated with their environments, structures that breathed and lived alongside their inhabitants. To Chloe, it was a scrapbook of failure. To Ethan, it was his life's work. He had simply nodded. "If that's what you want, Chloe," he had replied, his voice even. His lack of protest had frustrated her. She had wanted a fight, a passionate display that would validate the drama of her decision. Instead, she got quiet compliance, which she misinterpreted as weakness, as an admission of his own inadequacy. Now, in that beige room, Vance pushed the papers toward him. "Just sign here, Mr. Hayes, and here, an initial at the bottom of each page." Ethan picked up the pen. He could feel Chloe's eyes on him, her leg jiggling with nervous energy. He looked past her, at the window overlooking the gray city street. He had known this was coming. He had seen the way she looked at Marcus, the way she had started speaking of wealth not as a means to security, but as a measure of a person's worth. He had tried, in his quiet way, to bridge the growing chasm between them, but he could not build a bridge to someone who had already decided to live on the other side of the canyon. He knew the true value of his firm. He knew about the Helios project, the culmination of years of tireless work, a contract so massive and so secret that it was protected by an ironclad non-disclosure agreement. The deal was on the verge of closing, but it had not closed yet. His lawyers had been clear. As of that day, the firm's valuation was based on its current modest earnings, not its speculative astronomical future. To disclose the potential of the Helios deal before it was signed would have been a violation of the NDA and legally unsound. He was not hiding an asset. He was simply honoring a contract. A distinction Mr. Vance had been too arrogant and too eager for a quick resolution to investigate. He uncapped the pen. The scratching sound it made on the thick paper was the only noise in the room. He signed his name, his hand steady. With each signature, he felt not a loss but a letting go. He was letting go of the woman who saw his passion as a flaw, his quiet nature as a weakness, his integrity as a lack of ambition. He initialed the final page and pushed the stack back to the center of the table. Vance checked these signatures with a brisk, efficient air. "Excellent. The court will certify this within the week. A copy will be mailed to you, Mr. Hayes." He began packing the documents into his briefcase, the snap of the latches sounding like a cell door locking. Chloe stood up, smoothing down her designer dress. She looked at Ethan, still seated, his hands resting on his old leather portfolio. For a moment, a flicker of something unreadable crossed her face. Pity, perhaps, or a final, fleeting doubt. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cool, confident smile. "Well, Ethan," she said, her voice bright and brittle, "enjoy your quiet little life. Try not to spend all your pennies in one place." It was her parting shot, the final stone cast to ensure he knew his place in the new order of her world. He was the past, the humble beginning she was now embarrassed by. She turned and walked out of the room without looking back, leaving Ethan alone with the scent of her expensive perfume and the echo of her casual cruelty. He remained seated for a long moment, his fingers tracing the worn seams of his portfolio. He was not angry, he was not even sad anymore. He simply felt free. The foundation of his old life had been demolished, and he was now free to build something new. The walk down the pier felt longer than it was. With every step, Chloe's confidence swelled. The sheer, undeniable reality of the yacht was proof of Ethan's deception. How could the man she had divorced, the man with the hobby firm and the simple, frugal habits, possibly afford this? It was a logical impossibility, unless he had been hiding a vast fortune from her all along. The anger she felt was righteous, a clean, purifying flame. It burned away any lingering guilt she might have had about the divorce, about Marcus, about the cold finality of that last meeting. Ethan wasn't the humble man she had left. He was a liar, a cunning fraud who had played her for a fool. "Look at the finish on that hull," Marcus muttered, his voice dripping with a mix of disdain and technical appreciation. As a man who prided himself on recognizing quality, he couldn't deny the craftsmanship, and it irked him. Custom mix paint. Must have cost a fortune just for that. "We'll get a full appraisal, of course," Vance said, his tone businesslike. "Naval architects, marine surveyors, the works. We'll itemize everything, down to the last silver teaspoon. He won't be able to hide a single dollar." They reached the gangway, a graceful arc of teak and polished steel that led from the pier to the aft deck. A man in a crisp, white uniform stood at the top, his posture relaxed but observant. He nodded as they approached. "Good afternoon. May I help you?" "We're here to see Mr. Hayes," Vance announced, his voice booming with unearned authority. "Tell him Arthur Vance is here. And Chloe Hayes." He intentionally used her married name, a small, petty barb designed to set the tone. The crewman didn't flinch. Of course, mister. Hayes is expecting you. Please come aboard. He gestured for them to precede him up the gangway. The moment Chloe's foot touched the deck, she felt a subtle shift. The solid, unyielding wood of the pier was replaced by the gentle, almost imperceptible roll of the massive vessel. The air here felt different, cleaner. The sounds of the marina were muted, replaced by the quiet hum of the yacht's internal systems and the gentle lapping of water against the hull. And then she saw him. Ethan was seated in a large, comfortable-looking armchair, a glass of iced tea on the table beside him. He wasn't dressed in a captain's uniform or a flashy designer outfit. He wore simple linen trousers and a soft gray, long-sleeved shirt, the kind of clothes he had always worn. He looked up as they approached, and a calm, neutral expression settled on his face. He didn't look surprised or scared or angry. He looked patient. "Chloe, Mr. Vance, Marcus," he said. His voice even, and devoid of any discernible emotion, he nodded to each of them in turn. "Welcome aboard." The casualness of his greeting was disarming. They had come for a confrontation, armed for battle, and he was welcoming them as if they were guests for a pleasant afternoon chat. "Don't welcome aboard us, Ethan," Chloe snapped, recovering her footing. "You know exactly why we're here." "I have an idea," Ethan said calmly. He gestured to the plush seating area arranged around a low teak table. "But this might take a moment. Please, sit down. Can I offer you something to drink? Water? Iced tea?" "We're not here for refreshments," Vance cut in, stepping forward and placing his briefcase on the table with a solid thud. He remained standing, a deliberate power move. "We are here because you have committed perjury and deliberate asset concealment during your divorce proceedings. This vessel, the Cornerstone, constitutes a significant marital asset that you failed to disclose. My client, Chloe Hayes, is legally entitled to 50% of its current appraised value." Ethan looked from Vance's stern face to Chloe's furious one. He then glanced at Marcus, who was standing with his arms crossed, a smug smirk on his face, enjoying the show. Ethan's gaze lingered on him for a fraction of a second before returning to the lawyer. "I see," Ethan said. He leaned back in his chair, a picture of unnerving tranquility. "You've certainly come prepared." "Damn right I'm prepared," Vance retorted. "I have copies of the signed divorce decree, your sworn financial statements, which are now clearly fraudulent, and a preliminary report on this yacht. Estimated value. The number is substantial." He let the word hang in the air. Chloe couldn't stay silent. "How could you, Ethan?" she demanded, her voice rising. "All that time you were playing the poor, struggling artist, making me feel guilty for wanting more. And this whole time, you were sitting on a fortune? You let me walk away with a house and a few $1,000s while you had this?" She gestured wildly at the opulent surroundings, the polished wood, the gleaming chrome, the sheer, breathtaking scale of it all. Ethan took a slow sip of his iced tea. He placed the glass back on the table with a quiet click. "Why don't you have a look around?" he suggested, his voice still infuriatingly calm. "Get a feel for the place. Then we can discuss your concerns." He looked past them, toward the open glass doors that led into the main salon. "Julian will show you around." The crewman who had greeted them stepped forward. "This way, please." Vance hesitated, suspicious. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had expected shouting, denials, perhaps a desperate attempt to bargain. This calm, almost indifferent invitation to tour the very evidence of the crime was bizarre. But Chloe was already moving, her eyes wide, with a mixture of fury and a greedy curiosity she couldn't suppress. She wanted to see it all. She wanted to feel the full weight of what had been kept from her, to fuel her righteous anger. Marcus followed, eager to find flaws and belittle the accomplishment. After a moment's hesitation, Vance nodded curtly and fell in step behind them, leaving Ethan alone on the aft deck, watching them disappear into the cool, luxurious interior of the yacht. He reached over and picked up a familiar object from the chair beside him, his worn leather portfolio. He placed it on the table in front of him, his fingers resting lightly on its surface. The tour was part of his plan. He wanted them to see it. He wanted them to feel its value, to let their greed and arrogance reach a crescendo. Because the higher they climbed on their mountain of false assumptions, the farther they would have to fall. The interior of the Cornerstone was a masterpiece of understated luxury. There were no gold faucets or garish chandeliers. Instead, the design spoke in a language of textures, light, and space. Polished mahogany blended seamlessly with cool, cream-colored leather. Walls of glass offered panoramic views of the sea. The main salon was vast, with ceilings higher than those in their old house, furnished with custom pieces that were both beautiful and comfortable. Chloe ran her hand over the supple fabric of a sofa, the cool surface of a stone sculpture. Each touch was like a fresh stab of betrayal. This was the life she should have had. This was the world she had been denied. It's all very neutral, Marcus commented, his attempt at a dismissive tone failing to mask his awe. Lacks personality. He pointed at a large abstract painting on the far wall, a swirling vortex of blues and grays. Probably just a generic print from a hotel supplier. Julian, the crewman who had overheard, paused and turned slightly. Actually, sir, that's an original Gerhard Richter. Mr. Hayes acquired it at a charity auction last month. Marcus's face tightened. A Richter. He knew the name. He knew what it meant. He fell silent, his critical eye now scanning the room with a new, grudging respect. This wasn't just money. It was taste. It was culture. And that somehow was even more infuriating. They moved through the yacht, a vessel that felt less like a boat and more like a floating boutique hotel designed by a genius. They saw the formal dining room with a table that could seat 20, the state-of-the-art cinema, the fully equipped gym and spa. With each new discovery, Vance mentally revised the yacht's value upward, a silent calculation that made his palms sweat with anticipation. This was the case of a lifetime. Chloe, however, was on a different journey. She wasn't just calculating value. She was rewriting history. Every memory of Ethan's supposed frugality was now cast in a sinister light. The times he'd said they couldn't afford a lavish vacation. A lie. His preference for cooking at home over dining at expensive restaurants? Deception. His long hours locked away in his home office with his doodles? He had been in there, she now imagined, like some modern-day Scrooge McDuck, counting his vast hidden fortune. The narrative solidified in her mind, turning her from a woman who had left her husband into a victim who had been cunningly robbed. They ascended a graceful, spiraling staircase to the upper decks. They saw the owner's suite, a sprawling apartment larger than the entire ground floor of her house. It had its own private deck, a massive bathroom clad in marble, and a walk-in closet that was a room unto itself. Chloe stood in the center of the bedroom, turning in a slow circle. This was where he slept. The quiet, boring man she had discarded was living a life beyond her wildest dreams. The injustice of it was a physical ache in her chest. "The helicopter pad is just through here," Julian said, gesturing toward another set of glass doors. "Of course," Marcus muttered under his breath. A helipad. He felt a growing sense of unease. This level of wealth was beyond his own aspirations. He had always seen himself as the alpha, the success story who had rescued Chloe from a life of mediocrity. But the man who owned this yacht was not mediocre. He was in a different league entirely, a different stratosphere. The thought was deeply unsettling. Finally, the tour concluded back on the aft deck where Ethan was waiting exactly as they had left him. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the deck. He had poured himself another glass of iced tea. His portfolio lay on the table, closed. Vance did not wait for an invitation this time. He stepped forward, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. The tour had only strengthened his resolve. The sheer scale of the deception was breathtaking. "All right, Hayes," he began, his voice sharp and cold. "The games are over. We've seen it. We know what you did." He slapped his hand on his briefcase. "I have here a settlement offer. You sign over a 50% share of this vessel to my client, and we will consider not pressing for criminal charges. That is our opening and only offer. You have 1 hour to accept." Ethan looked at him, his expression unreadable. "Criminal charges?" he repeated softly. "Perjury is a crime, Mr. Hayes," Vance said, leaning in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. "Lying on a sworn financial statement is a serious offense. It carries jail time. Think about that. All this," he gestured around them, "and you, in a 6 by 9 foot cell. It would be a shame. Sign the papers. Do this the easy way." Chloe stepped up beside her lawyer, her arms crossed, her face set in a hard, determined line. She felt powerful, backed by the unassailable logic of the law and the undeniable proof of the yacht. The humiliation she had felt moments ago had been transmuted into pure, righteous fury. "He's right, Ethan," she said, her voice dripping with scorn. "For once in your life, do the smart thing. You owe me this. You owe me for the years I wasted believing in you. You owe me for the lies." Ethan's gaze shifted to her. He held her eyes for a long moment. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. The gentle hum of the yacht and the distant cry of a seagull were the only sounds. Marcus shifted his weight, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Ethan's calm was unnatural. It was the calm of a chess master who sees the board 10 moves ahead, while his opponents are still celebrating a captured pawn. "You believe I owe you," Ethan said, his voice quiet but resonant. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, a confirmation of her entire worldview. He let the words hang in the air, allowing them to feel the full weight of their confidence, their certainty. He wanted them at the absolute peak of their arrogance before he began, because he knew that the truth, when it finally arrived, would not be a gentle correction. It would be a demolition. The tension on the aft deck was thick enough to taste. Chloe, Vance, and Marcus stood like statues of indignation, waiting for Ethan's inevitable capitulation. They had presented their case, made their threat. The next move was his, and in their minds, he had only one move to make: surrender. Ethan finally broke the silence. He didn't look at his accusers. Instead, he reached for his worn leather portfolio, his movements slow and deliberate. He laid it flat on the table and unfastened the simple brass clasps. The sound was a soft, metallic click in the heavy air. "Did you really think you could get away with this, Ethan?" Chloe's voice cut through the quiet, sharp with a new wave of impatience. "After everything I did for you, I tried to make something of you, to push you to be more. But you were always just small." The insult was meant to wound, to provoke a reaction, to finally break through his infuriating calm. "This whole thing," she gestured at the yacht again, "it's just another lie. A big, shiny, desperate lie to make yourself feel important." Ethan paused, his hands resting on the portfolio. He looked up at her, and for the first time, there was something other than neutrality in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was a deep, profound disappointment. "Small," he repeated softly, as if tasting the word. "You always thought my world was small because it was quiet." He finally looked away from her, his gaze falling back to the portfolio in front of him. He opened the cover. Inside were not financial documents or legal papers, but sketches. Pages of beautiful, intricate architectural drawings, rendered with a precise and artistic hand. Marcus craned his neck, a flicker of professional interest warring with his contempt. Even upside down, the drawings had a captivating power. But Ethan didn't show them the drawings. He reached into a hidden sleeve on the inside cover of the portfolio, a pocket Chloe had never known existed, and pulled out a single, neatly folded document. It was a standard piece of corporate letterhead, unassuming and plain. He didn't look at Chloe or Marcus. He looked directly at Arthur Vance. "Mr. Vance," he began, his voice taking on a new, authoritative tone. "Your primary practice area is family law, but your firm's website mentions a background in corporate litigation. Specifically, mergers and acquisitions, is that correct?" Vance was visibly taken aback by the question. It was so far off topic it felt like a non sequitur, a desperate attempt to change the subject. "I have experience in that field, yes," he said dismissively. "What possible relevance does that have to this situation?" "It has every relevance," Ethan replied. He unfolded the document and held it up. It wasn't for them to read. It was for him. He was not presenting evidence. He was delivering a verdict. He read the headline aloud, his voice clear and steady. "Press release. For immediate distribution. Helios Innovations is pleased to announce the successful finalization of acquisition of the Sterling Ventura Architectural Group." He paused, letting the name sink in. Sterling Ventura, his hobby firm. Vance's eyes narrowed, a flicker of confusion appearing on his smug face. Chloe frowned, not understanding the significance. Ethan continued, his gaze still locked on the lawyer. "The deal, valued in the low nine figures, positions Helios at the forefront of the sustainable luxury development market." He lowered the paper and looked at Vance. The final, crucial piece of information was not on the page. It was for him to deliver personally. "The acquisition was finalized, and the funds were transferred to my personal accounts on March 14th of this year." He let the date hang in the air. March 14th, a date that meant nothing to Chloe or Marcus, but to a lawyer, a date was everything. Vance's mind, trained to process such details, worked furiously. Their divorce. The final certification from the court, his mind raced back through the file. The date of certification had been in September of the previous year. September, 6 months before the acquisition. 6 months before the nine-figure sum ever existed. The blood drained from Arthur Vance's face. His entire case, his threats, his righteous indignation. It was all built on the premise that Ethan had possessed this wealth during the marriage. The money from this acquisition was not a marital asset. It was post-divorce income. It was Ethan's and Ethan's alone. There was no fraud. There was no perjury. There was no case. There was nothing. In the space of a single sentence, his ironclad legal argument had evaporated into thin air. His career flashed before his eyes, the potential for sanctions, for a lawsuit, for bringing a frivolous claim, for utter professional humiliation. He felt a wave of nausea. Chloe didn't understand the legal nuance, but she saw the look on her lawyer's face. She saw his confidence shatter like glass. "What?" she asked, her voice small. "What does that mean?" Vance couldn't speak. He just stared at Ethan, a look of horrified comprehension dawning on his face. But Ethan wasn't finished. He had only demolished the first pillar of their arrogant assault. Now he turned his attention to the second. His gaze shifted from the pale, trembling lawyer to the smug, confident figure of Marcus, who still hadn't grasped the magnitude of what had just happened. "Marcus," Ethan said, his voice calm and even. "You run a venture capital fund, don't you? Apex Investors, I believe it's called." Marcus, sensing a shift in attention toward him, puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim the spotlight. "That's right," he said, a smirk returning to his lips. We're on the verge of closing a landmark deal, something that's going to change the game in the green energy sector. He glanced at Chloe, a look that said, "This is what real ambition looks like." "A landmark deal," Ethan repeated, nodding slowly. "With a next-generation solar technology company. You were seeking a single major institutional investor to fund the entire first round, if I recall the pitch deck correctly." Marcus's smirk faltered slightly. "How would you know about my pitch deck?" Ethan's expression remained placid, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "Because the sole institutional investor you have been pitching for the last 6 months, the one whose commitment your entire fund and your entire deal depends upon, was Helios Innovations." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Helios Innovations, the company that had just bought Ethan's firm. The connection was sudden, brutal, and undeniable. His face went slack with shock. "My new partners at Helios are, as you might imagine, quite thorough," Ethan continued, his voice relentless and precise. "Given the potential for a conflict of interest and my own expertise in sustainable design, they forwarded me your prospectus this morning for a final opinion." He paused, letting the reality of the situation sink in. Ethan, the man Marcus had belittled and dismissed, had just been asked to pass judgment on his entire future. "Your projections were optimistic." Ethan said the word optimistic, carrying the devastating weight of a death sentence. "Your proposed cash burn rate was unsustainable, and the underlying technology, while promising, is still years away from commercial viability. My recommendation to the board was unequivocal." He held Marcus's terrified gaze. "They passed on the investment. The official email from their acquisitions chief went out about an hour ago. You might want to check your phone." The world seemed to tilt under Marcus's feet. His bravado, his confidence, his entire identity as a dealmaker was built on the success of this one deal. Without it, he had nothing. His fund was just a name on a piece of paper. His promises to his other, smaller investors were just empty words. With trembling hands, he pulled his phone from his pocket. His fingers fumbled as he unlocked the screen and opened his email. And there it was. The subject line was cold and final: Re-Apex Investors Funding Proposal. He didn't need to read the body of the email. He could feel the failure radiating from the screen like a cold wave. His face, which had been a mask of arrogant superiority just moments before, crumpled into a picture of absolute ruin. He stared at the phone, his mouth hanging open, the color draining from his cheeks. He was finished. And the man who had finished him was standing 10 feet away, watching him with the dispassionate air of an architect observing a controlled demolition. The silence that descended upon the deck was no longer tense. It was funereal. It was the silence of a battlefield after the decisive final shot has been fired. Arthur Vance stood frozen, a statue of professional terror. Marcus stared at his phone, the device that had just delivered the news of his financial execution. And Chloe. Chloe looked back and forth between the two men she had chosen to champion her cause, her face a canvas of disbelief. Her invincible lawyer was defeated. Her titan of industry boyfriend was a fraud. The entire foundation of her new life, the life for which she had discarded Ethan, had crumbled to dust in less than 5 minutes. She turned to Ethan, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. The anger was gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading confusion. "Ethan," she began, her voice barely a whisper, I didn't know. I didn't know about any of this." Ethan looked at her, and the dispassionate mask he had worn finally fell away, revealing not anger, but a vast, weary sadness. "No, Chloe," he said, and his voice was no longer quiet. It was full, resonant, and carried the weight of a decade of unspoken truths. "You didn't know. Because you never asked. You never once, in 10 years, sat down and asked me to explain the drawings in this portfolio. You just called them doodles and walked away." He stood up, his full height seeming more imposing than ever on the deck of his magnificent yacht. He was no longer the quiet, unassuming man from the beige lawyer's office. He was the man who had built this, all of it, not just with money, but with a vision she had been too blind to see. "You saw a quiet man and assumed he was a weak man," he continued, his voice a calm, relentless current. "You saw patience and called it a lack of drive. You saw integrity and you called it a lack of ambition." He took a step toward her and she flinched, taking an involuntary step back. "Do you remember our 5th anniversary?" he asked. His voice was soft, but the question landed like a physical blow. "I wanted to take you to Copenhagen to see the new sustainable housing projects. I had been studying them for months. I tried to explain how they were revolutionizing urban living. You said," he paused, his memory perfect, "you said Copenhagen? How boring. Can't we just go to St. Bart's like normal people?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Do you remember when I sold my father's car, the one he left me, to buy the new plotter I needed for the Sterling Ventura office? You told me I was a fool for trading plastic for a fancy printer. That fancy printer, Chloe, is what allowed me to create the renderings for the Helios project. The project that paid for all of this. He was not shouting. He was simply holding up a mirror, forcing her to see the reflection of her own words, her own choices, her own profound blindness. This was his list of grievances, not delivered in anger, but as a statement of fact, a final, painful accounting of their life together. You said I was small, he went on, his voice dropping again, drawing them in. You said my world was small. A week ago, Chloe, I was in Vienna. I was standing on a stage accepting the Pritzker Prize. He let the name of architecture's highest honor settle in the silent air. It's the equivalent of a Nobel Prize for my field. They called my work a paradigm shift in sustainable architecture. The project they cited most heavily was a private island resort in the Seychelles, the world's first fully carbon-neutral, self-sustaining luxury habitat. The initial design concept, the very first sketches for that resort, are in this portfolio. He gently tapped the worn leather cover with his fingertips. These doodles, as you call them, they are now considered one of the most important architectural achievements of the decade. He looked at her, his eyes holding a universe of disappointment. I was in Vienna, receiving the highest honor of my profession, and that was the day your lawyer served the papers on my office in New York. While I was being celebrated as a visionary by the entire world, you were trying to sue me because you thought I'd bought a new car. He shook his head slowly. The scale is what you never understood, Chloe. You thought I was small because you could only measure worth in dollars you could see today. You never, ever understood the value of building something that would last. Chloe stared at him, her mouth opening and closing silently. There was nothing to say. There was no defense. Every word he spoke was the truth, a truth she had willingly and deliberately ignored for years. The man she had divorced wasn't the man she thought he was. He was a giant, and she had been living in his shadow, complaining that he wasn't tall enough. The humiliation was absolute, a crushing weight that left her breathless. As the last of Ethan's words faded into the quiet hum of the evening, a new voice emerged, crisp and sharp as breaking ice. Mr. Vance. All eyes turned toward the main salon doors. A woman stood there, framed by the elegant interior. She was dressed in a flawlessly tailored dark gray suit, her bearing radiating a formidable intelligence and an absolute lack of patience. She held a tablet in one hand, her expression one of utter disdain as she surveyed the scene on the deck. She had clearly been there for some time, an unseen observer. My name is Anya Sharma, she announced, her voice cutting through the stunned silence. She walked forward, her heels clicking with authority on the teak deck. I am lead counsel for Helios Innovations, and as of this morning I am also Mr. Hayes's personal attorney. Arthur Vance looked as if he had seen a ghost, Anya Sharma. He knew the name. Everyone in high-stakes corporate law knew the name. She was a legend, a legal predator of the highest order, known for dismantling entire firms for breakfast. The fact that she was here representing Ethan transformed his terrible situation into a cataclysm. Anya stopped a few feet from Vance, her eyes cold and merciless. Your client, Miss Hayes, she said, nodding curtly at Chloe without truly looking at her, has made a frivolous and malicious claim based on demonstrably false pretenses. Furthermore, your conduct here, the threats of criminal action, the baseless accusations of fraud, constitutes professional malpractice and harassment. She glanced around the deck. We have, of course, recorded this entire conversation. A motion for sanctions will be filed with the State Bar Association by 9 a.m. tomorrow. We will be seeking your disbarment. Vance swayed on his feet, his face ashen. Disbarment. The word was a death sentence. His career, his reputation, his entire life's work was about to be incinerated. Anya then turned her piercing gaze on Chloe. As for you, Miss Hayes, she said, her tone dropping any pretense of professional courtesy. Your divorce settlement is final and unassailable. Any further attempts to contact, harass, or extort Mr. Hayes in any form will be met with an immediate restraining order and a civil suit for damages so significant it will make your head spin. She paused, letting the threat land with its full, brutal weight. Am I making myself clear? Chloe could only nod, a tiny, jerky movement. She felt stripped bare, exposed and powerless under the woman's withering glare. Finally, Anya's gaze fell upon Marcus, who was still staring at his phone as if hoping the words on the screen would magically change. And Mr. Apex Investor, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. A word of advice. When you build a house of cards on a foundation of lies, don't be surprised when a slight breeze blows it all down. I suspect your other investors will be calling you shortly. I'd have a good story ready if I were you. With that, she turned back to Ethan. Her entire demeanor softened instantly. Ethan, my apologies for the intrusion on your evening. Not at all, Anya, Ethan said calmly. Your timing was, as always, impeccable. I do what I can, she replied with a small, wry smile. She then turned back to the disgraced trio. The gangway is behind you. I suggest you use it now. There was no negotiation, no argument. It was an order, absolute and final. Arthur Vance, a broken man, fumbled to close his briefcase, his hands shaking so badly he could barely work the latches. He turned, not daring to look at Chloe, and practically stumbled toward the gangway, a man fleeing the scene of his own destruction. Marcus looked up from his phone, his face a mask of hollow shock. He looked at Chloe, but there was no support in his eyes, only a blank, inward-looking terror. He was already trapped in the prison of his own failure. He followed Vance down the gangway without a word. Chloe was the last one left. She stood alone on the deck of the magnificent yacht, surrounded by the evidence of a life she could have had, a man she had never truly seen. She looked at Ethan, her eyes swimming with a toxic cocktail of regret, shame, and a bewildering sense of loss. She opened her mouth to say something, an apology, an excuse, a plea, but no words came. What could she possibly say? He simply looked at her, his face no longer sad, just empty. He had already said everything that needed to be said. With a final choked sob, she turned and fled, following the other two down the gangway and back onto the solid, unforgiving ground of the world she had chosen. Ethan watched them go, three figures shrinking in the twilight, their predatory confidence shattered into a million pieces. He did not feel triumphant. He did not feel vindicated. He just felt the quiet, profound peace of a storm that had finally passed. 3 months later, the late autumn sun cast a golden glow over the calm waters of the Mediterranean. Ethan sat on the aft deck of the Cornerstone, the same spot where the confrontation had taken place, but the air was entirely different. It was peaceful, filled with the scent of the sea and the distant aroma of grilled fish from a small coastal village. He wasn't sketching in his old portfolio. He had a new one with a clean, unmarked cover. Inside were his preliminary ideas for his next project, a foundation, a center for young, promising architects who had vision but lacked resources, a place to nurture the kind of talent that the world, in its rush for an easy profit, so often overlooked. Anya Sharma sat across from him, sipping a glass of wine. Her severe legal attire was replaced by a simple, elegant sundress. The sharp edges of her professional persona had softened, revealing the warm, intelligent friend she had become. They were no longer just lawyer and client. They were partners in this new venture. "The board for the foundation is confirmed," she said, setting her glass down. "We have architects, philanthropists, even a university provost. They're all incredibly excited about your vision." "Good," Ethan said, a genuine smile gracing his lips. "The work is what matters, giving them the tools I almost didn't have." He looked out at the horizon, a line of perfect, unbroken blue. The yacht, once a symbol of a painful past being put to rest, had become a tool for the future. It was his mobile office, his sanctuary, his place of inspiration. He was no longer defined by what he had escaped, but by what he was building. He rarely thought of Chloe. When he did, it was with a distant clinical pity. He had heard through the grapevine what had happened. Vance had been suspended from the bar for a year, his reputation in tatters. Marcus had declared bankruptcy, his Apex Investors Fund exposed as little more than a fantasy. He had disappeared, leaving a trail of angry minor investors in his wake. And Chloe had been forced to sell the house. Without Marcus's phantom income, she couldn't afford the mortgage and the taxes. The grand life she had grasped for had slipped through her fingers like sand. The last he heard, she was working in an administrative role at a mid-level marketing firm, living in a small apartment downtown. One afternoon, in a waiting room before a meeting, Ethan had idly picked up a magazine from a coffee table. There he was, on the cover. It was a feature in a major design journal, a 10-page spread on his work, his philosophy, his vision for the future of architecture. The headline read, "Ethan Hayes, the quiet architect changing the world." Miles away in her cramped office cubicle, Chloe saw the same magazine on her manager's desk. She stared at the cover, at the photo of Ethan. He was standing on a construction site, blueprints in hand, looking not at the camera, but at the structure rising behind him. He looked confident, peaceful, and profoundly happy. He looked like a man who knew exactly who he was and what he was worth. She felt a hollow ache spread through her chest. It wasn't anger anymore. It wasn't even envy. It was a deep, crushing understanding. She had been given a diamond, and she had traded it away for a piece of sparkling glass because it glittered more brightly under the artificial lights. She had spent a decade looking at this man and had never once truly seen him. Her pursuit of more had left her with less than nothing. She had chased the flashy, noisy reflection in the window, never realizing the real treasure was in the room with her all along. True worth is not measured by the noise you make or the status you project. It is forged in the quiet hours of dedication, in the integrity of your work, and in the character you build when no one is watching. Chloe had demanded a life of significance, but she had failed to recognize the quiet significance of the man beside her. She wanted a king, but she didn't have the wisdom to see the one who was building a kingdom, not for show, but for purpose. What do you think is the most important quality in a life partner? Is it ambition, kindness, or something else entirely? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and insights enrich this community, and we love reading them. If you found this story meaningful, please give it a like and subscribe for more tales of justice, redemption, and the quiet strength that so often triumphs in the end. Thank you for watching.